Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glendivid Books. Many people think my guest today is the conscience of the country. But if you think that's a bit exaggerated, then let's call him the voice of our conscience. His blogs are widely read, hugely applauded, and circulated right across the country. And now they've been collected and put together in this book. And here it is. It's called India, the Wasted Years. And joining me now to talk about that particular collection that he's put together is the author, Avesh Shukla. Avesh Shukla, this book is a collection of your blogs, which first appeared on your site, The View from Greater Kailash. You say they are critiques, not judgments. More importantly, you add, the message of this book is that silence is no longer an option. Being neutral in the face of oppression, misgovernance, and the collapse of a nation is to support the wrong and spurn the right. That, you add, is not neutrality, but complicity. So clearly, your blogs are written in criticism and in opposition. But the critical question is, of what?
Of what?
That's right. Of whom are you being critical? Of whom are you in opposition?
Karan, I'm being critical primarily of the government at the center, but it's not confined to that. I'm also being critical of my own colleagues, my own service, people who have retired and are still serving. I'm being critical of the senior veterans in the defense forces who don't speak out. I'm critical of the media. I'm critical also at certain points of time of our society, which I find has changed a lot in the last 7-8 years. In fact, you wrote an article, I think it was just last week, where you mentioned your childhood, you recollected your childhood, and how much India has changed since then, and that this is not the kind of India or the kind of society where you would like to grow up in again. So I think that puts it in context. It's a very wide canvas, and the criticism is generally of what is happening in this country, and all of us, in some measure or the other, are contributing to it.
Let's then talk about some of the people, some of the institutions that you are critical of, and let's start with Narendra Modi, because in the first instance, your collection of blogs are clearly critical of him. You write, Modi's destruction of India can be divided into three broad phases: demonetization, 2019, and COVID-19. Why do you call it destruction of India?
Let me begin, Karan, by confessing that I began my blogging life as a supporter of Mr. Modi. In 2013, I had written about it also in one of my first blogs. It was titled, if I remember correctly, Why I Shall Support Modi in 2014. Since then, in the last 7 years, one has been considerably disillusioned. In fact, disillusion is a very mild word now. One is now apprehensive of the direction in which he is leading us. He had a very good platform on which to build in 2014. His legacy from the UPA government was in two parts. One was the negative one, where we saw at that time that the government was indecisive. It was being intimidated almost by regional satraps. A nationalistic vision was missing. It was more regional pressures and regional agenda which was coming. There was much talk of corruption, etc. But then on the positive side, what Mr. Modi inherited along with the negatives was a sound economy, which was still growing at 7 to 8%. We had survived the global financial crisis of 2008. 220 million people had been raised above the poverty line. We had become a rights-based society. The welfare measures were working. the UPA government, for all its faults, had done a lot to introduce legislations like the Forest Rights Act, the right to education, the right to food, midday meals, etc., etc. So Mr. Modi had the good and the bad to work with. And he had promised us when we voted for him in 2014 that he would work on that. He'd work on getting rid of the weaknesses and the deficiencies and build on the other things. Unfortunately, he has not done that.
So, in other words, your disillusionment is because the promise he held out is a promise he's betrayed.
Yes, that's a major part of the disillusionment. But even if he had not delivered on his promises, if he had just taken us on the same route, economically, socially, etc., I feel we would not have been so badly off as a society, as an economy, as an administration, as we are today. Because what he did, I mean, this is my personal view, what he did was he substituted the promises which he had made before the elections with his own agenda, the agenda of the organizations which were backing him. I don't have to name them. And the entire agenda which he had promised, he completely substituted it with a new agenda of social division, of non-cooperation with the state governments, deterioration and takeover of the autonomous institutions, including the judiciary and the various institutions we had, which were functioning fairly well during the UPA time. So
what you're saying is he conned people, particularly, to take yourself as an example, he conned you with promising he would do certain things which he didn't do, and he replaced them with an agenda that you hadn't voted for. You were therefore fooled by his rhetoric, fooled by his presentation of himself, and the betrayal is therefore underlined by a sense of being fooled by him, being tricked and trapped.
Absolutely. In one of my blogs, I have termed him as the Pied Piper. You know, that's exactly what he did. He promised something else, but he started or attempted to deliver on something else.
Quite right.
And that is why not only did he lose the opportunity to build on a platform which was fairly decent, which was given to him by the previous government, he has amplified those earlier deficiencies I was talking about. The indecisiveness of the UPA government has been replaced by an over-centralization, where no consultations are held before taking decisions. The broad-based corruption of those days has now been replaced by a very selective crony corruption, where only a few of the selected, favored few are entitled to the benefits of what the government's largest can hand out. The regionalism of that time has been replaced by a very aggressive majoritarianism. The cooperation with the states has been replaced by, I mean, you remember he had promised us cooperative or constructive federalism. I mean, that is completely in tatters.
Okay.
And society has been riven. Absolutely, we have been split asunder into. I'm shocked to see that people from my own social background, education, economic status, even they've been taken in, and as the voting percentages show, Mr. Modi still has.
Because there's a very important part of one of your blogs that I wanted this moment to quote to you. You say there is a malevolent common thread that runs through the three phases of Modi's destruction. I'll remind the audience that those three phases are demonetization, 2019, and COVID-19. And you describe that thread in a certain amount of striking detail. You say subjugation of constitutional and regulatory institutions, gross misuse of enforcement and police agencies, undermining of the judiciary, politicization of the armed forces, an overbearing arrogance and insensitivity to public opinion, ruthless crushing of dissent and false propaganda, and image building on a Goebbelsian scale. Now, assuming you're correct, and not for a moment do I doubt it, but none of this could have happened without the willing and active participation of civil servants, military officers, the judiciary, intelligence and enforcement agencies, and the media. So Modi is not alone in doing what he's done. He had the support of an entire system and the people who man that system. He successfully co-opted them.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right, Karan. And in fact, what he has done, he has utilized these various instruments of governance in the manner in which he wanted to utilize them to further his agenda, and not in the constitutional mandate which these instruments enjoyed. So he has not created any new institution. He has utilized what you mentioned: the civil services, the media, the autonomous institutions, etc., the judiciary, to his own benefit. Now,
And
as far as
distorted them in the process.
sorry,
And distorted them in the process.
absolutely, they are unrecognizable from what they were and what they were supposed to be. And I blame, like I told you, I blame my own service, my colleagues. Although it is wrong to assume that the government services, especially the All India services, etc., the IAS, the IPS, etc., it is wrong to assume that they are willing partners in this. They are silent. I think they have been intimidated to the point where it is safer to remain quiet, just do the bidding of the powers that be. I have a theory about the IAS, in a light-hearted way. The human body, the human spine has 33 vertebrae. My theory is that we lose one vertebrae with every year of service. And the more senior we get, the more pliable we get. And by the time we reach the top, there's practically no spine left. Not because we are collusive, but because we don't stand up. We don't stand up, we don't speak out. And that has allowed Mr. Modi to do what he has done, to distort the systems where now a lot of them appear to be part of the party rather than part of the government.
Let me ask you this. Mr. Modi is one of many prime ministers that we've had in the last 71 years since independence, but he's now becoming one of the longest serving. How would you compare him, not with all of those, but with Indira Gandhi, who also did great damage during the emergency to things that we honor and cherish? Constitutional guarantees of freedom, the right of the opposition, the right to protest, even habeas corpus under the way the Supreme Court behaved. How do you compare Modi to Indira Gandhi? Many people often try and make that comparison and still suggest she was worse, she did worse damage. But she also corrected herself in 77. How then would you compare the two?
My personal view, Karan, although I'm no historian, my personal view is that the damage being done now is far more fundamental. It is going to be longer lasting. It is going to be almost irreparable. We will another few years of this, and we will not be able to retrieve the damage done to the country. Don't forget that she at least had the courage to declare an emergency. She did it under the Constitution. Of course, she had a pliable precedent to rubber stamp it, but it was a declared emergency. And she, for whatever reasons, she decided to bail out after 2 years and lost. So the damage was restricted to 2 years. What's happening now is it's been 7 years, might be another 2.5 years is certainly on, and maybe another 5 years. I think that's a period, that length of the same policies, the same type of administration. I don't think is something we are going to be able to get out of or to retrieve or repair in a hurry.
In other words, Modi's is an undeclared emergency and more insidious. Indira's was
Insidious.
Indira's was upfront. This is creeping under the system and eating it from inside and making it hollow. Is that what you're suggesting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very insidious, creeping kind of poison that is seeping into the system. And another major difference I would like to point out. What Mrs. Gandhi did was to the administrative structure, whether it was politics or administration or the judiciary. What's happening now is that poison has spread into the social fabric of the society. And once it gets there, once it takes root there, it becomes that much more difficult to eradicate at a subsequent point of time. So, in another word, what I'd like to say is that hers was the kind of damage she did was to the official structures, the political structure, etc. What's happening now is much deeper, much more fundamental, much more in here. And therefore, my worry.
One more question about Mr. Modi before I move on. You have a very powerful blog about his handling of the pandemic that we're all living through. I'm going to quote from it. We need to retain in our collective national memory the near apocalypse the nation is going through and the persons responsible for it. We should never forget, never forgive. I can understand the fact that we don't ever want to forgive. But are you sure we should never forget? Because that would mean we would keep living those dreadful moments over and over again.
We need to. We need to. We need to ensure that this kind of situation, these conditions never arise again. We need to ensure that this kind of insensitive government or governance rather doesn't happen again in this country. I mentioned in that same blog, Karan, how the Jews have a long memory. It has helped them to survive. Because, as somebody said, that the struggle for democracy is a constant struggle against forgetting the good as well as the bad, particularly the bad. If we don't remember, how are we going to take corrective actions in the future and ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again? That's what I meant when I said we should not forget. We should remember what we've been through. We should remember who have been responsible for this and take conscious decisions and make conscious choices in the future so that this doesn't happen again.
In other words, our capacity to remember, to never forget, to never forgive is our means also of redemption.
Absolutely, absolutely. Public memory is very short, especially when you're having 3 million pages being posted onto the internet every single day. One crisis overtakes the other and we forget but this is a visceral crisis. This is a fundamental crisis, what we have been through. And therefore, we need to retain it in our collective public memory, even if not in our individual memories.
The other section of society that you're very critical of is corporate India. You devoted several blogs to criticizing its support for what you call renegade channels, and they are basically just two, Republic Television and Times Now. Again, I'm going to quote from those blogs. A corporate entity has the same legal rights as an individual. Surely, you ask, it should have the same moral and social duties as an individual to condemn immoral ideology, to abjure hate and communalism, to not incite one community against the other, to distinguish between truth and falsehood. In the West, it's very common for corporates to stand up and be counted. Why in India are they so scared to raise a hand?
Two reasons, I think, Karan. One is the general fear of the intimidation. It happens every day over here. The use of the government's sovereign powers and regulatory agencies to crack down on the corporates. There are no built-in checks to prevent that, as in more advanced and developed countries. That's one, fear. The second is the regulatory framework we have under which corporates work. Although a lot of the licensing and regulatory framework has been eased out and reduced, but most of it still remains. So corporates are at the mercy of the government. And that is why it's so important to break the nexus or the connection between corporate houses and the media. Because if corporate houses are controlling the media, they're susceptible to enormous pressure from the government to fashion their narratives in the media in a particular way, which is exactly what is happening in India. And of course, when your systems don't work, when your judicial systems don't work, when your regulatory agencies are suborned by the government, the corporates have nowhere to turn to except to comply with the government's.
I'll explore that link that you believe is the wrong one between corporates and the media in a moment's time. But I want to first put to you something that emerges from what you said about corporates. They are extremely rich entities and they are owned by extremely rich people. And yet wealth doesn't protect them from being intimidated by the government. Government regulation or the threat of reprisal means that even the richest, economically the most powerful, wilt in the face of one man's tyranny.
That's true. You remember how a particular company, a big corporate, was persuaded, within brackets, to hand over the Bombay airport, the management of the Bombay airport, to another company. Even though it had complete rights to running that airport. So it's a fact of life. It's a fact of life here, but that does not excuse their spinelessness. Not all corporates are intimidated to the. You have Mr. Bajaj, for example, who came out famously with that statement that he would not like his daughter to grow up in this kind of an intimidatory atmosphere. And then he pulled out certain ads from certain channels.
Absolutely.
A couple of other corporates also followed them.
Let me interrupt and say, you're talking of Rajiv Bajaj, who runs Bajaj Auto, and another company who behaved very similarly with the same commitment to principle was Parle. Both of them decided that they were not going to support with their money and their advertisements channels that they believed were not just reprehensible, but also dividing the country. And you make a very important point about that. And that's the next thing I want to take up with you. You say not only should Republic and Times Now as channels be boycotted, but you go one step further. You say pressure and the boycott should extend also to those members of India Inc. who continue to support these channels with their advertisements. Your book lists names of the companies that are advertising on Republic TV, that are advertising on Times Now. I won't embarrass you by repeating those companies' names, but you're saying something that if these corporates believe that it is in their right to promote, support, and nurture channels that divide our country, then let us also put pressure and boycott those corporates, because those corporates are financing what eventually becomes the division and destruction of our country.
Absolutely. It's a vicious cycle. The corporates fund these channels. These channels look for TRPs. Unfortunately, our social mentality and mindset is such that we go in for sensationalism, abuse, WWE type of panel discussions every night, which leads to higher TRPs. Higher TRPs then persuade the corporates to put in more money into these channels. And this is how this vicious cycle continues. But it has to be broken. The government won't break it because it suits the government. The corporates won't break the cycle because it suits them. They're making money. It has to be us, you and me, like they do in the West. It's civil society has to be aware and has to stand up and speak out at certain points. You know, you remember the.
Can I interrupt? Do you believe civil society will? Because the truth is, the TRPs of channels like Republic Now and Times Now are growing. People spend a lot of time, even in the social circles you and I mix in, criticizing these channels. And yet, when they go home, they make a point of watching them. So I ask you that question again. Do you really think civil society will make that move?
I don't really have an answer to that, Karan. They may, they might not, but we have to keep hammering away at it. We have to keep making this point that, which is what I mentioned in the beginning, that I also blame society. We are not responsible enough. We take the easy way out. And therefore, they can do it abroad. You remember Brightheart, that channel, the purveyor of hate of Mr. Trump. More than 1,200 companies have pulled out ads from Brightheart because of pressure from civil society.
Absolutely.
So we have to wake up. We have to wake up. And, this connects with another point I have, that retired bureaucrats, retired defense services people, etc. We don't speak out enough. We don't speak out enough to the conscience of society.
Okay. There are two people in your blogs who are considered icons almost in India that you are surprisingly very critical of. Let me bring them up one by one. The first is Ratan Tata. You say of him, notwithstanding his tall claims to philanthropy, Ratan Tata always knows which side of his bread to butter, and this is usually the winning side. That is not how Indian people think of Ratan Tata. Why do you have such a poor impression of him?
Mr. Tata is a philanthropist, no doubt. He's probably one of the biggest philanthropists. But he doesn't speak out when on issues that require to be highlighted, or the issues that require to be condemned or commented upon. It's all very well to fund a school here or an NGO there, but this is small change for somebody of the stature of Mr. Ratan Tata. He needs to do more. I mean, he can't assuage his conscience by giving out a few crores for certain welfare activities and not speak out where the future of the country is concerned, where the type of governance we need is concerned. You remember the withdrawal of the Titan ad. Titan had taken out that ad a few months ago about remarriage, it was, or interfaith marriage. It just took 24 hours of protest by some goons, I think in Bangalore it was, or Hyderabad, for him to pull the ad. Now, I mean, that doesn't impress me at all.
I think, just to correct the record, that protest first happened in Ahmedabad. I may be mistaken, but I don't think I am. But you're right. It was withdrawn very quickly, and it was said that it was being withdrawn to protect the security of Titan staff, which may or may not be the truth. But instead of standing up for an ad that most people thought was touching and beautifully made, Titan capsized. Let me come to the second major celebrity that you're critical of. This time, it's a cinematic hero, perhaps the greatest of them all, Amitabh Bachchan. This is what you write of Amitabh Bachchan. Amitabh Bachchan has too many bones in his mouth to be able to bark. What are you exactly suggesting? That he's let down the country or that he's let himself down?
He's not let himself down. I mean, he's doing pretty well, I should say, financially, from the various endorsements, etc., which he does. He's also a great mm, mm, the face of a lot of government ads on which is good, I mean, on wildlife, on conservation, on uh, things like water supply, Swachh Bharat, and all that. That's fine. But he's an icon. He is a role model. He's acquired that stature because the public look up to him. But he has a duty to that public also, which, what I mentioned earlier about corporates also having duty. So similarly, he cannot just ride the gravy train, make money out of it, and ignore the other issues. I mean, once in a while, you'd expect him to come out with a tepid, bland statement, at least, if you don't want to go the whole hog and condemn the government. So at the end of the day, he's letting himself down also. He's letting down his stature. And so one is disappointed, extremely disappointed, because you expect such people to once in a while make a mild anodyne kind of statement also, if you will, but do show that you are concerned with some of the visceral issues of this country also, and not just making money.
Can I put it like this? Your criticism, it seems, of both Ratan Tata and Amitabh Bachchan is very similar on important issues where they have the capacity, the stature, and the economic standing to protect them. They still fail to speak out. That's fair, isn't it? They're scared to speak out. They haven't got the guts, presumably. Or perhaps they have something that worries them that would make them vulnerable to the government. Either there's a weakness in a closet they're hiding which would make them vulnerable to the government, so silence is protection, or they lack the guts, the moral commitment to speak out. But one or two applies to both, doesn't it?
Yes, probably all the things you mentioned, probably all of them is what holds these people back. But then, how do you differentiate the men from the boys? I mean, everybody has these fears. We all do. I mean, you dig deep enough into anybody's life, the most ordinary citizen's life, and you'll find something with which to, if not crucify him, at least make life difficult. I don't see what kind of financial fears Mr. Amitabh Bachchan could be having. He's okay. At the end of the day, I think it's just greed. It's just greed, which makes them.
Did you say greed?
Greed.
They want
greed for more influence.
They want more from the gravy train.
Absolutely. But these people are influencers. You have a duty. I mean, it's not just a voluntary thing. You have a duty. Otherwise, you step down.
In contrast to the Ratan Tatas and Amitabh Bachchans is the future, the light down the road that you saw when young people in their hundreds, thousands, came out on the streets of India to protest at the time of the Citizenship Amendment Act, at the time of the National Register of Citizens protest. This is what you wrote of those protests. These are miracles which will make this country a much better democracy. You said, for the very first time in our 71-year history, the concept of secularism has come out of rarefied and elite portals. It now mingles joyously with ordinary citizens in the streets, parks, and universities of India. Explain that a bit more fully.
Karan, the concept of secularism is perhaps the most debated in this country, even more so nowadays. But the debates remain academic. They're either academic, or they are in parliament, or they are in the high courts and the Supreme Court. It is very, very rarely that you get the common man, the boy and the girl in the street to express their concept of secularism. And some of these protests, especially the CAA and the NRC protests, showed us in no ambiguous terms at all how strong the roots of secularism are in this country. And because these protests were tried to be branded as being supported or in favor of a particular community. So they came out of their hijabs and burqas and everything. And you remember that famous case where that young student from JNU, a Hindu girl, spoke out against the CAA, and she said, "I'm a Hindu, but I oppose this particular bill." There was a recent Pew Research survey, just a couple of weeks back, which said that 84% of their respondents in India, and they had interviewed more than 42,000 people, 84% of the respondents from all communities were in favor of secularism and for having the faiths together, for tolerance. So it was an occasion when the people spoke as against the rulers and the judges and the parliamentarians, and they spoke very loudly. And that gives me a lot of hope, that because it was primarily the youngsters, who are going to be the future of this country, who were making this particular point. It was very exhilarating for me.
But there was one other community that at that time won your applause. And when I say won your applause, that's the euphemism. When I read your blog, you were almost bowled over by them. And I'm talking about the Muslim women of India. A moment ago, you referred to them when you said they came out of their hijabs. This is what you write. They have sprung the biggest surprise. Theirs is the real secular pushback against both Hindu fundamentalists and these obscurantist ulema. But I want to put you, this is not so much a miracle as a reflection of the fact that the rest of us didn't know them, didn't understand them, and made no effort to get to know them, which is why we were surprised. But they were always strong, determined, loving, caring, and committed. It's just that our eyes were not seeing, or maybe worse, they were closed.
True, absolutely. But I called it a miracle, Karan, because it required a lot of courage for these women who have been brainwashed, traditionally told that this is your role. You don't come out onto the streets. You stay at home, and you do whatever has to be done at home for a hasif. But these women came out. So it was a rebellion not only against the CAA, but a rebellion against their own religion or certain traditional rites of passage of that particular religion. And so that's what makes it even more secular. That's what makes it even more secular. It's not just the CAA, it's their own traditions and past, which they have come out of. And hopefully, having tasted that kind of freedom in Shaheen Bagh and other places, they will not be the same again.
We've come right to the end of this interview, but there's one last question I have to put to you. Right at the end of your book, you quote from William Shirer's famous book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. I'm going to read that quotation out, and then I want to ask you whether there's really a hidden meaning in that quotation that applies to us in India as well. This is the quotation. The cardinal error of the Germans who opposed Nazism was their failure to unite against it. At the crest of their popular strength in July 1932, the National Socialists had attained but 37% of the vote. 63% of the German people who expressed their opposition were much too divided and short-sighted to combine against a common danger, which they must have known would overwhelm them unless they united. And yet they failed to unite. Now, those percentages are uncannily similar to the percentages that brought Mr. Modi to power in 2014. Hence, my question, is there a lesson here for the Indian people?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The similarities between the two, the Third Reich and this period of India is unhappily passing through. The similarities are only growing. And these may be coincidences, but they also, I mean, the voting percentages, etc. These may be coincidences, but they also indicate that other countries have gone on this path with disastrous results. And therefore, it is time. It is time for our disunited, cantankerous opposition parties, etc., to read the writing on the wall. To read the writing on the wall, because that wall is not going to be standing there for much longer if this goes on. So this is the time to read the writing on the wall.
Can I put this to you? I'm going to quote how you began that answer. The similarities between the Third Reich and the India of today are only growing. It's not just, I take it in terms of the statistics that brought Mr. Modi to power and those that brought Hitler to power in 32, that there's a similarity. That similarity stretches into many other areas, doesn't it? Treatment of minorities, treatment of dissent, treatment of the opposition, the attitude to running the country, the cult of personality around the leader, the Führer, or Pradhan Sevak, as he likes to call himself. That similarity stretches across many horizons, doesn't it?
It does, including also what you didn't mention, control of the media, the manufacturing of fake news on a colossal scale, the rewriting of history. These are a tremendous similarity. And also another very important similarity is that the overwhelming support of the people, of the citizens of the country for this kind of a ruler. That is a frightening similarity. That is a frightening similarity.
Is a similarity that should worry you particularly. Hitler had the support of the German people in 32 when he came to power, and let's be honest, he retained it right up to the last year or so when he had to commit suicide. Mr. Modi,
and even today, if you look at the neo-Nazis.
Absolutely, but similarly, Mr. Modi today has the enormous support of the Indian people, despite demonetization, despite COVID-19, despite 2019, he still has that support. For many, he is beloved, just as Hitler was beloved in the 30s. That's the problem for you, isn't it?
It should be a problem for all of us, Karan.
Okay.
It should be a problem for all of us.
That is very pithily put. I thank you, Avesh Shukla, for joining me, for making time for this interview, and for expanding on your thoughts. Take care.
Thank you, Karan. It was a pleasure to have been here with you. Thank you very much.
Take care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.